time for Matthew's Gospel, a short introduction. So, in here, we're going to start, as we always do, with authorship, context, and big concerns or themes. And we'll move through Matthew's Gospel. First, a kind of an overview. Matthew has often been read as a text that's very concerned about order, fulfillment, and continuity with the Jewish tradition. Well, these features are central. Matthew is also a profoundly political and socially charged gospel. Remember, we've been emphasizing the integration of theology or faith with politics and economics and culture. In the ancient world, these were always together. Matthew was written in the context of Roman imperial domination, including the destruction of the Jewish temple, economic inequality, and religious marginalization. The early Jesus followers are struggling to define their relationship with the Jewish faith following the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the rise of the Pharisees as the dominant group within the Jewish faith. Sadducees, right? They're connected with the temple. Boom, temple gone. So they're not going to be important. The Essenes, they were waiting for God to intervene and destroy the Romans. Well, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, so they're out of the picture, right? The Zealots, violent revolutionaries crushed by Rome, so they're out of the picture. Only the Pharisees are left, trying to reshape Judaism in the absence of the temple. And Christianity, in a way, is doing the same thing. The Jewish followers of the Jewish Jesus are trying to figure out what it means to be followers of Jesus apart from the temple and apart from the traditional Judaism that is being shaped by the Pharisees. So in this context, Matthew presents Jesus as a liberating Messiah, faithful to the God of Exodus. And so Jesus in his life and teaching confronts unjust power structures, political, economic, religious. And in so doing, he renews and reaffirms God's central emphasis upon the practice of righteousness. That is justice. Whenever you come across that word righteous or righteousness in the New Testament, or the Old Testament for that matter, we should think more of our modern word of justice. And Matthew is seeking to form a community committed to justice, mercy, and faithfulness, consistent with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ. So who was this Matthew? Well, we're not sure. It could have been the Matthew that's referenced in the Gospels, that is the tax collector in Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, and chapter 9, verse 9, called Levi in Mark chapter 2, 14. We're not sure, and we won't spend a lot of time on that as it's so uncertain. We do know the gospel itself was not given a signature by Matthew. Matthew doesn't identify himself in the gospel. From the themes and the issues in Matthew, it appears that the audience seems to be a Greek-speaking Christian community composed mostly of Jews, with some Gentiles, non-Jews, struggling to define itself in relation to the Jewish tradition, as I mentioned. Likely located in Syria, perhaps the city of Antioch. That's in modern-day Turkey, Antakya, located near the Syrian border. The concern, again, is how shall the followers of Jesus live in continuity with the Jewish faith, even as they are going on a different path by following Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ. They're following Jesus contrary to what is becoming the dominant Jewish approach, being defined by, guess who? The Pharisees. The dating, 80 to 90, about 10 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. So Matthew's gospel is emerging from a semi-marginalized community negotiating survival under the empire. Rome represents not only political domination, but economic exploitation and ideological control through religion. Matthew's frequent references to the kingdom of heaven function as an implicit critique to Roman claims to absolute rule. The Gospel of Matthew does not spiritualize salvation it instead reimagines power itself. You might hear some echoes then from Mark's gospel, which we talked about power. Matthew's main concern is about righteousness, justice, reflecting a community wrestling with how to live faithfully amid injustice. So, two major concerns in Matthew's gospel: continuity, how is the church in Christian faith, the life of faith, in continuity to the sacred traditions, the best of those sacred traditions of Israel? Who was Jesus within the promises of God? And then, secondly, the change to a new community, a kind of a new Israel, offering instruction in how to be the church and to be a disciple of Jesus, this new justice. This is a new way of being in the world that fulfills the old. So we can think of a theme running throughout this is the fulfillment of God's liberating promise in Jesus and the early church. A key passage in Matthew describes really what Matthew's trying to do. Matthew chapter 13, verse 52, and he, that is Jesus, said to them, therefore every scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. And Matthew's going to use that word house a lot because the church is meeting in a house. The church is seen as a new oikos, a new economy, a new house, a new way of being in the world. What's the structure of Matthew's gospel? There's a prologue, Matthew's gospel, chapters 1 and 2, and then 5 books paralleling the 5 books of the Torah. We're going to see Jesus as being presented as the new Moses and the church as the new Israel. Each of these books ends with a formula unique to Matthew. Quote, and it happened when Jesus had finished these sayings that. So you can see that in Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 to 29, Matthew chapter 11, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 53, chapter 19, verse 1, chapter 26, verse 1. It's a very well-structured gospel. Matthew's going to alternate between stories, narrative, and teachings. And see, the narrative's going to come first in the book, and then the teachings, and at the end of the teachings, and it happened when Jesus had finished these sayings that. That's the transition. So all of this is being organized around then a new covenant that comes at the end, the new covenant of obedience, the new discipleship that's grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew chapter 26, verse 2 through chapter 28, verse 20. That's where we're going to get the resurrection. So now let's turn to the major themes following this structure of Matthew's gospel. The prologue. The promised future kingdom of God has already dawned, inaugurated by Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and exaltation. See your textbook, page 25. The prologue begins, like it did in Mark and like it did in Luke, begins to proclaim who Jesus is. We get introduced to Jesus in these prologues in Mark and in Luke and in Matthew. So Jesus is presented right away as the liberating Messiah, King, Teacher, Emmanuel. As your textbook says, Jesus is the promised Messiah, the Son of David, the Son of God, the Son of Man, Emmanuel, the one to whom the Old Testament points. And Matthew opens in with all of these titles. Matthew 1:1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham. 2 huge figures in Judaism, right? David, King David, and Abraham. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place this way. Chapter 1, verse 18. The title of Emmanuel is in Matthew 1:23. King of the Jews, already there, Matthew 2:2. Messiah, Matthew 2:4. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Matthew 3:17. If you are the Son of God. Matthew 4:3, 4:5, right? Satan asking that in the temptations in the desert. All of these titles carry deep social pointing. They point to who leads Israel, the people of God, and thus now who leads the new Israel, the church, over against the claims of the Roman Empire to control human life. So right away we get this genealogy. The genealogy is about identity. Who are your ancestors? Who are Jesus's ancestors? Where did Jesus come from? Speaking as this human being, Jesus, who we know is also being revealed as Son of God. There's something old in the genealogy. Abraham, David, the continuity of the other names that are there, they're Jesus's ancestors. But there's also something new here. The inclusion of women in this genealogy. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, who we know is Bathsheba. This foregrounds a theme in Matthew of the outsiders, the survivors of violence, and the Gentiles. Going to undermine the old purity systems and affirm God's work through marginalized bodies and histories. So Jesus' birth narrative in Matthew is deeply political. And remember, this is unique to Matthew, the way the story is told in Matthew. The wise men from the east, for example. The east, where's east? Persia, which is a rival empire to the Roman Empire. And Herod is a client king of the Roman Empire. So this is a direct threat to his power when they come and say, where is the child who has been born king of the Jews? Herod is king of the Jews. Where is the child born who's going to replace you? So Herod, of course, is not happy about this. And he's going to seek to have this child destroyed. That story is only in Matthew. Jesus here is the fulfillment of God's plan, fulfillment of the hopes of Israel. Jesus completes the genealogy. And of course, Matthew keeps saying that all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Chapter 1, verse 22, 2:15, 17, 23, chapter 4, 14, chapter 8, 17, 12, 17, chapter 13, 35, 21, 4, 27, 9, 10. You can see that phrase reappearing constantly. Fulfillment is being emphasized in Matthew's gospel. So what else is being emphasized here is the kingdom of heaven. That phrase appears 31 times in Matthew. I'm not going to give you that whole list. I can give it to you in class if you want. Kingdom of heaven is a core concept appearing in key sections like the Sermon on the Mount. On the Mount is only in Matthew. And the kingdom parables in Matthew 13. What is this kingdom of heaven? It's concrete and it's practical. For Jesus, the kingdom is not some abstract afterlife, but rather a concrete social vision, a way of life, a way of being in the world shaped by specific attitudes, a vision of life, and practices. As your textbook says on page 25, this messianic reign, the kingdom of heaven, is continuing in the world as believers, both Jews and Gentiles, submit to Jesus' authority, overcome temptation, endure persecution, wholeheartedly embrace Jesus' teaching, and thus demonstrate that they are the people of God and the true witnesses to the world of the gospel of the kingdom. That's a lot going on there. So we're going to see how this plays out in each of the 5 books that then follow this prologue. This is a total reordering of human life under the reign of God. That's what Matthew is encouraging his readers to do. Get a new life. Book 1 starts chapter 3, verse 1, goes through chapter 7, verse 29. This is the new or higher righteousness. Central to this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus begins the sermon, Matthew chapter 5, verse 2. He began to speak and taught them, saying. Now, there are 2 other mountain scenes in Matthew, the Transfiguration in Matthew 17, and Jesus' final words with the disciples in Matthew 28:16, only in Matthew, up on the mountain. Big time in the sermon. We're not going to go through the whole sermon, but the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes, those famous blessed are statements. Blessed are, and in Matthew, it's the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Poor, that is, in solidarity, in spirit with the poor. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness / justice. for they will be satisfied. The merciful, the pure in heart, those who are single-heartedly focused on God and the well-being of their neighbor. The peacemakers, those who are persecuted for the sake of justice. These are central practices for the followers of Jesus. These saying, this is what is blessed. This is what focuses our lives here, are these beatitudes, be action words. We are to be poor in spirit, be in solidarity with the poor. We're to be righteous. We're justice seekers. We're mourners. We don't buy in. We don't believe the hype. We're woke. So Jesus is calling us to this new way of life. And that's the ethical heart then of the gospel, where Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He's not coming to abolish the law or prophets, as is said in Matthew 5:17, but to bring them to completion, to fulfill them. So the sermon's not some impossible ideal. It's a radical reordering of values. We are blessed. Our lives flourish as we live into this way of life. If we love our enemies, Matthew chapter 4, 43 to 48. Practice nonviolent resistance to evil, Matthew 5, 38 to 42. We don't do an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. We practice a creative nonviolent resistance. We live contrary to systems of accumulation of wealth. Jesus says, Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Rather, verse 20, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Right? This is contrary to this, I need more wealth. I need to gain. I need to compete to get stuff. Jesus is saying, no, you can't serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. So that's book 1, this new discipleship, and that continues that theme in book 2, chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 1, starts off with the narrative of 10 miracle stories, 10 plagues in the book of Exodus. See, we got a new righteousness that's going on. So as you read through those miracle stories, Matthew is telling those in a way that's saying, here's a new way of life. This is liberation from sin and death. And then the discourse comes. Here's the missionary discourse, right? We had narrative, story, followed by teaching. Jesus then gives instruction to the disciples how they're to continue that mission of healing and liberation. Jesus gives his disciples authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness, Matthew 10:1, which is exactly what Jesus had just been doing in the first part of this book. That was book 2. Now book 3, chapter 11, verse 2 through chapter 13, verse 53, the new kingdom of heaven, the reign of God. This is the turning point in the Gospel of Matthew as Jesus begins to move toward the Gentiles by the time we get to chapter 12. The narrative here in this book opens with the story of John the Baptist and the question, are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? What does Jesus say? Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Those are the works of justice, of healing, of inclusion, of bringing those who have been marginalized back into the fullness of life in community. Also in this narrative is a growing conflict with, not surprisingly, the Pharisees. All the way through chapter 12, Jesus plucking grain on the Sabbath, healing the man with the withered hand, words about a house divided against itself. Jesus says in 12:30, whoever is not with me is against me. The true kindred of Jesus are those who do the will of God, Jesus says in Matthew 12, verses 49 to 50. So that's the narrative in book 3. Then the discourse, we get 7 parables about the kingdom and discipleship. Parable of the sower, parable of the weeds and the wheat, parable of the mustard seed, etc., etc. And that's when we get to the end of that, when he says, have you understood all these things? They say, yes. Then Jesus says to them, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Right? This is the call to us to draw from the old, but to also know the new, to live out the new. We now move to book 4, chapter 13, verse 54 through chapter 19, verse 2. The narrative, the story of this book opens with Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. Matthew puts it this way, they took offense at him. Matthew 13:57. The high point of the narrative in this section is Jesus' establishment of Peter as the rock upon which the church is built. Peter represents sort of the disciples as a whole. This echoes the parable from an earlier chapter of those who hear the word and act on them are like a wise man who builds his house upon a rock to withstand the storm. See Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. Jesus is the foundation of the church. This is all these Christological titles being given to Jesus in this section. Lord, Son of God, Son of Man, Son of David. And then the disciples' role is kind of highlighted because Matthew tells or edits the story of the feeding of the 5,000 compared to Mark. He omits some things, like in Mark, the disciples misunderstand Jesus. Matthew doesn't have that. In Matthew, the disciples immediately understand, even though they express doubt that they have enough food. In Matthew, the disciples fetch the food. In Matthew, then, the disciples duplicate Jesus' action as they're the ones who are breaking the bread and distributing the loaves to the crowd. So that's all in that narrative section. And then in the discourse, there's a focus on life within the community of the church. What's true greatness for a disciple? Humility. Then Jesus talks of the importance of forgiveness within a life of community. Matthew's focused here on building a community of discipleship and resistance. The church, the ecclesia, appears explicitly not as an institution of dominance, but as a community accountable to Jesus' teachings. And this is where we should read the Great Commission not as narrowly as evangelism, but as a liberating lens that calls us to teach obedience to Jesus' justice-oriented way of life. Jesus calls us to a discipleship that involves embodying the kingdom ethic in a world still shaped by empire. Come to the final book, book 5, chapter 19, verse 3 through chapter 26, verse 1. This is the kind of the new crisis for the community. It's going to lead into the passion. So the narrative begins with the teaching about divorce, difficulty, how to handle that, rich young man, the laborers in the vineyard. Then Jesus in chapter 20, verses 17 to 19, foretells the passion. Then you have the request of the mother of James and John, not the disciples themselves asking as in Mark, but who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus directly challenges this hierarchical power then. He is saying the greatest are the least of those who come to serve, not to be served. And here we get the centrality of justice and mercy in Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the most important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. See, it's the old and the new, but what's key is the new, is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The discourse then opens with these woes to the Pharisees and the lament over Jerusalem. And Jesus is condemning the leaders who burden the poor or protecting their privilege, who prioritize a kind of ritual purity, self-righteousness over justice, and who legitimize inequality through some kind of theological or religious language. And this culminates in this amazing apocalyptic judgment story in Matthew 25, verses 30 to 45, the famous identification of Jesus with the least of these. Whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. The hungry, the stranger, the sick, the imprisoned. That is the most vulnerable people under systems of power. Salvation, unity with Christ is inseparable from solidarity with those who are hurting. This is the culmination of Matthew's gospel. And then the Passion story begins in Matthew 26. We'll cover that in more detail in our last little video on the Passion narrative. So, conclusion on Matthew. It's a gospel of liberation. As I said at the beginning, this is the fulfillment of God's liberating promise in Jesus and the church. So Matthew becomes this powerful resource for communities seeking faith amidst struggle to live in accord with God's will for the flourishing of all human beings. That is justice. Jesus is portrayed as a liberating Messiah who confronts unjust power, heals the marginalized, brings them fully back into community, and forms a community that's committed to justice, mercy, and faithfulness. For Matthew, theology, religion, it's never neutral. It's always shaped by our identification with Jesus, who is in solidarity with those who are hurting, with the poor. So Matthew's offering both critique and hope. Critique of systems that deny human dignity, and he's offering hope that is rooted in God's reign, breaking into history through faithful, embodied resistance that imitates the very powerful life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's Matthew in a short little treatment.